That policy requires us to read the following statement before we start these meetings. Please inform me if you are personally aware of any claims under any patent applications or issued patents that would be likely to be infringed by an implementation of the specification or other work product that's the subject of this meeting. You need not be the inventor of such patent or patent application in order to inform us that a claim might exist, nor will you be held responsible for expressing a belief that turns out to be inaccurate. And if you'd rather discuss IP patent-related questions outside of this meeting, you're invited to contact me or any other IMS staff member at any time. IMS also has a participation agreement published at imsglobal.org/PA, which essentially asks that the details of the discussions in these meetings, any documents that are in draft form, not be shared outside of the membership of this group. I will need to step away from the meeting here in just a few minutes, so I'll be passing over the host responsibilities to my colleague Bracken. And in the meantime, we will begin going through the various questions that we've collected and earmarked for today's discussion. And I think Martin has some slides prepared for that.
Yep, slightly last minute presentation, so I do apologize for that. But yeah, I just sort of collated some of the questions that we've had over, well, the past few months when we've been doing these roundtables, kind of, simplified some of them to get some clean answers. We will have some kind of break points in it to stop and see if anybody has any questions in the chat, or we've received a few questions in the last day or so that I haven't had a chance to put into this, so we can answer those as well. And unless there's anything else that you want, Mark, shall we just jump in?
No, just a reminder that we are recording this session as other roundtable sessions have been recorded, and we will make that available in that LTI Roundtable Resources Forum post. Also in that shared Google document with our agenda, you can access any previous roundtable session to see demos or maybe get some insights, answers to your questions, including ones that we'll address today. We'll add that. We'll add the recording from today's meeting to that same page. So thanks, Martin. All
right. So this is the LTI Roundtable Q&A with the date in the wondrous British format. So hopefully, if this is going to let me. Okay, so we're just going to jump straight into the questions. A lot of these questions are just kind of common questions that we've had a bunch of people ask in various different guises. So we've condensed them down into a set of questions that hopefully should answer some common problems that people might have, or anything else. I might hand over to different people to answer some of these questions, but for the moment, we'll start with this one. So this is a common question that comes up of what is the best practice for exchanging and generating tool key sets? So in the specification for LTI, for LTI 1.3, we specify that a platform must always provide a JWKS endpoint from which you can get the public key that is used to check signatures and make sure that requests from the platform are valid. For a tool, however, there are actually 3 different options for the way that a tool might expose these key sets. So the first one is that the tool might have a JWKS endpoint. The second one is that a platform might generate a private key for the tool and say, here is your private key. I want you to use this private key to sign all the requests for this particular registration. Or the tool might be asked to generate its own private key and give the public key back to the platform, and the platform can then use that public key to validate requests coming from the tool. So the reason why we have 3 options here rather than just one is because of the way that LTI 1.3 kind of evolved over time when we started doing it. initially there were some concerns around whether tools were going to be able to generate sufficiently secure keys by themselves, and some of the platforms wanted to put that kind of onus of generating the secure key on themselves. But over time, some tools also, when you've got the likes of Google and Microsoft acting as a tool, they also don't want people to be generating their private keys for them. They want to do that kind of thing themselves. So there was a little bit of back and forth, and a little bit of a battle of the wills, in a sense, as to which one of these would be best. For kind of general best practice, it's advised that you support the tool providing its own JWKS endpoint. This is kind of the mechanism that we've mostly settled on from a kind of community standpoint. Most of the platforms support tools providing their own JWKS endpoint, and a number of tools are also providing that as well now. There are still a couple of instances, Moodle being the big one, that requires the tool to generate its own private key and give the public key to Moodle. But hopefully
the public key to Moodle.
Yes, yeah. So you give the public key to Moodle, don't give it the private key.
Yeah.
You generate your own private key, and yeah, but hopefully that will change down the line.
Yeah, there is a ticket pending on the, and it's aimed at Moodle 3.9, where Moodle will support both model, but it's still not been totally moved through the motion. Hopefully 3.9.
Do you have an sort of general expectation about when 3.9 might be released?
Usually it's in May. They have a very fixed schedule, Moodle on the Moodle side. So yeah, so basically the ticket is there, the code has been done, but it's still pending integration. And so until it's not integrated, this cannot be in 3.9, but work is done. So there is still a good chance for it to happen for 3.9.
Yeah, so the general advice is, if you're starting from scratch with a tool, do the tool JWKS endpoint. It gives you the benefit of being able to rotate your keys as a tool. You can also, have one private key for all of your, like all of your integrations, all of your registrations that you're doing with different platforms, and then you can just have one private key that you rotate on a regular basis to keep it secure. All right. We will be able to come back to any of these questions if people want to kind of dig a little bit deeper.
I just want to add about that. I guess it's important to understand that when you expose your key set, it doesn't have to be on a pair integration standpoint. And so as a tool, you might do your own. You might decide to do one pair integration, but it's totally fine to reuse a single key set across all your integrations. And same goes for platforms. Platforms may expose just a single key set, but some platforms actually would have a different key set per integration. So that's still a platform or tool decision. Either way is fine.
Yeah, I guess just to make sure that you shouldn't expect one scenario or the other.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So this is a common question and the cause of a fair amount of confusion among people using LTI is, can somebody please explain what the different versions of LTI are and their extension specifications? So in order of release, these are the different versions of LTI, which at first glance seem quite counterintuitive. So we started off with LTI 1.0, which was a basic LTI launch, 1.1, which introduced basic outcomes, 1.1.1, which introduced the moderator role, 1.2, which introduced the tool consumer profile, 2.0, which introduced the LTI2 registration flow, and a whole bunch of other services. And then LTI 2.0 was deprecated because the kind of complexity of that spec was getting so large that it wasn't actually feasible for people to implement it in a reasonable amount of time, and the kind of barrier to entry was getting too high, which was why the step back was taken for LTI 1.3 to sort of say, hey, look, what is the core of LTI? What is LTI actually doing? And how can we improve that and improve the security around that? So that's what LTI 1.3 did. We took a step back to the world of LTI 1, and we said, okay, if we were to bring LTI 1 up to the modern day, with rather than using OAuth 1, using OAuth 2, rather than using form posts, basic form posts, using JWTs and asymmetric signing rather than shared secrets. That's what 1.3 gave us. So it was a step back from 2.0 in kind of feature set wise, but it was a step forward in kind of core build functionality and security. And then the kind of outlier on there is LTI 1.1.2, which is the patch on LTI 1.1 that fixes the kind of OAuth OpenID Connect security issue that is present in LTI 1.1, where you can potentially man in the middle somebody doing an LTI launch. There's another question on that later on, so we can talk a little bit more in depth on that. The other thing that it's worth noting here is that as of LTI 1.3, the core of LTI is version 1.3. This is the bit that explains how LTI launches are done, how you communicate with services, anything like that. Beyond that, so deep linking, the names and roles, provisioning service, assignments and grades, all of those extension specifications have their own numbering. So something that has been, again, a little bit of confusion is when somebody's looked at the assignments and grade service and seen that the assignments and grade service is version 2.0, and they immediately think, oh, does that mean it's LTI 2.0? Which is not the case. It's just that those extension specifications have their own versioning, which allows us to kind of evolve those without having to reiterate on the core spec every time we want to do it. So that's the numbering. Hopefully we won't have another case where we go backwards, and from now on everything is rosy and going forwards. But that's a little bit of history on why that is the case. Ignore LTI 2, it's deprecated. Please don't implement it. Stick with 1.3, and then look out for the latest versions of all the extension specifications around them.
Yeah, and then 1.3 is going to be there to stay for quite some times, because as Martin pointed out, it's just the core mechanics. And actually, so you don't expect a 1.4 anytime soon, but you're going to see services and new messages enrich the ecosystem around 1.3. So this is the way we're going to do extensions. No more having a spec that grows bigger and bigger, but more having more and more additional extensions built around it. Yeah.
Right. So straight onto this other question, which was, can somebody explain the vulnerability and how it works for the cross-site request forgery that was present in LTI 1.1, but is fixed in LTI 1.3. So there is actually this video here. I'm not going to play it because it's quite long. I'll give out a link to this presentation and everything so people can download it and also load this video that goes through and gives an example of how you can interrupt a launch in LTI 1.1 potentially, and send it to somebody else and trick somebody else into logging in as your current user. It's worth noting that although this is a potential vulnerability, it's not a vulnerability that allows like me as a user to log in as somebody else. I can't steal other people's logins and log in as somebody that I'm not supposed to. The kind of trick to it, in a sense, is that I can create a launch that is going to log me into a system. So I'm going to, I work for Turnitin, so I'm launching in from Blackboard or Canvas into Turnitin. I could capture that request that as I go from Blackboard to Turnitin, and I could trick somebody else into clicking a link that would then execute that request on their computer. So they would be logged in as me. At first glance, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of benefit to this. Why would it be of any use if I'm just logging somebody else in as me? But what that then allows you to do is potentially, if they're entering any personal information or filling things in, paying for things within that tool, there's potential that they will be doing it as a different user, not their own. And I would get access to that. So there is it's quite an edge case, and it's not going to be a big issue for a number of tools, but it's still an important one that we should fix. And again, this video goes into a lot more detail about it if you want to kind of watch the nice, fun, animated version that I have there. So linking with this and kind of the back and forth of doing OpenID Connect, there are a number of questions around like handling cookies and what we do with this. Now, in general, this is all still a little bit up in the air. It changes from day to day, not quite that fast, but it changes reasonably often. There was a recent update to Chrome for Chrome version 80, which has changed the way that they handle third-party cookies. So cookies that are inside iframes. That means that you have to label them as being same site none, and also they only work over a secure connection. So there are a number of kind of things like this that you have to keep up to date with, make sure that your cookies are set correctly so that they are setting same site as none, that they are set to secure. But also there are cases where third-party cookies might be disabled completely. And in that case, how do you behave inside an iframe if you don't have cookies at all? Do you break out? Do you kind of redirect them in some way? And again, there are a few different resources here. So there's the first link that I put on here, which is to the IMS's explanation of the same site cookies that was the recent change to Chrome. And then there is also a link out here to one of the previous roundtables that we did that goes through a bunch of different examples of like how to handle not having access to cookies and what you should, what you could do. But I'm not going to say what you should do because it varies from tool to tool. Some people might never want to be in an iframe at all and always pop out into a new window. Some people might prefer to stay in an iframe at all costs. But there are different ways of kind of managing that problem and solving it. So there's some useful resources on that there. On the subject of resources, is there a place where I can find example code and resources for implementing LTI Advantage? Yes, there is. Luckily, there is a GitHub repo on the IMS GitHub called LTI Bootcamp, and that GitHub repo has a whole bunch of links out to different example code repositories that people have built, some libraries that people have built, general presentations that have been done both at roundtables and at face-to-face meetings, just any other helpful resources. We've tried to kind of collect them all into one reasonably accessible place. So if you want to start anywhere, that is a really good place to start for kind of looking at those details. So next question, this one's around identifying customers using my tools. So this is something that has changed between LTI 1.1 and LTI 1.3, mainly because the way that the authentication has worked, the way that deploying things has worked has changed. In LTI 1.1, I used to have a key and a secret, and I could set my as a tool, your customer 1.4, I'm going to give you a key and a secret, and you're going to put that in your platform, and then I know that whenever I get that key and secret, a request that's got the key in it and is signed with that secret, I know that that's customer 1234 that I gave that key and secret to. But the problem is in LTI 1.3 is that signature is now done by the platform, not by the actual customer themselves. So, I might be getting a request that is signed by Blackboard, not by an institution that is using Blackboard. So how is that managed in LTI 1.3? So we had this concept called registrations and deployments. So a registration is the exchange of credentials, and that happens usually at the level of an entire platform or an entire SaaS platform. Then beneath that, you have the concept of deployments, and a deployment is each time I actually go and install a tool on a particular instance of a platform. So if you imagine registration being Turnitin and Blackboard SaaS. So I go to Blackboard as Turnitin, and I say I would like to register Turnitin as a tool with Blackboard, and we do that registration together, and they put Turnitin into Blackboard's app store or whatever system they might have for managing that kind of process. Now, as a customer, as a university using Blackboard, I'm going to come along and I'm going to say, oh, I want to use Turnitin. I'm going to go to the app store and go, oh, Turnitin is already registered within Blackboard. I want to install Turnitin on my instance of Blackboard, and they would do that and click install. At the point at which they're installing Turnitin so that they can use it on their instance, that is the deployment, and they will get a unique identifier for that deployment. And what's important is that you use that ID, the deployment ID, to link it to a customer. So I might get a request and it will have it will be signed by Blackboard with a deployment ID. But if I don't know who that deployment ID links to, I don't know, who I'm going to bill or anything like that. So what I would do is I would say, I don't recognize this deployment ID. Please do something to prove that you are a customer of ours, whether that be log in with a username and password, or whether that be enter some code that we sent you in an email to link up that deployment. And then once that's done, you know that the request itself is secured by the registration, and then the deployment is now linked to an account because they've proved that that deployment is linked to a particular person who can log in as an administrator. So that gives you registration and deployment, and the customer who either you're going to bill or use.
So Martin, Jeff Alderson here. I have a question, and not to steal thunder, but this is one of the questions I sent in advance. This seems like the right place to ask it. And so the question I have from our development team was, are resource link IDs allowed to be accessed across multiple deployments for the same platform? So example is that it's the same client ID for registration, different deployment IDs. Can they all see the same resource link ID? Does this care?
There shouldn't be a case where a resource link ID is simultaneously owned by two deployment IDs.
Well, so you're implying that resource link IDs are owned.
So the resource link ID is an ID from the platform. So the platform is generating an ID to say this is like almost like the external ID for this resource that I'm going to give to a tool. And when you create that resource, you're creating it for a particular deployment of a tool. So you shouldn't ever get to the point where that same link is used by two different tools at once. The reason that I say at once is because how you want to manage it as a tool may vary if, for instance, a deployment is deleted. So, you know, we have cases at Turnitin where you might install Turnitin as a tool, create a bunch of links, then delete the deployment, and then create it again. If you did that, the deployment ID would change, but you would want it to link all of those resources back up to that deployment.
Yeah, the typical use case we're seeing in the wild is export import. Export a course with a whole bunch of resource links, import it to a new course either in the same registration or at a different school, right? Packaging courses and making them portable between institutions is not unexpected.
Yeah, if you're so if you're exporting and importing a resource from one course to another, then the resource link ID should change. You cannot have the same resource link ID in two different contexts or duplicated twice within a course.
If you don't mind me saying, just UCF, we're kind of an outlier in this because with deployments and all this, these individual IDs, we're more or less throwing them out because it doesn't affect us. We clone courses all the time. We basically are following our SIS course IDs or our or just the regular course ID that comes from Canvas. We've tended to ignore these because we know that our course IDs and our clone courses are going to be are going to be unique.
Yep.
And there's other uniquely identifying data that we can relink and rejoin our tool to the data.
Yeah, so there is actually there was actually a question similar to this later on. I think it's on one of the other slides around actually how to identify a resource internally. So you can, a resource link is the link coming out from a platform to a tool. It is not the tool's internal ID for that resource, in a sense. So you might have an internal resource that you can use in multiple places as a tool, but that doesn't mean that you should use the resource link ID as that tool's, as that particular resource on your side's ID. If you want to pass that around, you can pass around that resource ID as a custom parameter. If you're doing deep linking or something like that, you can return custom parameter and say, this is my resource ID. Or, you know, if it's a particular video, a particular book or something like that, it might have a book ID. You would pass that as a custom parameter that you would set during deep linking or in a common cartridge if you're doing it that way. And that way, even though you would get a different resource link ID every time it's copied or every time it's imported, you would always have that same custom parameter that identifies the resource for your tool.
Yeah, you could use custom parameters or URL. I mean, custom parameters slightly flavored.
Yeah, it's better to use a custom parameter where possible, because URLs can be manipulated and changed. But yes, it is possible to use a URL for that purpose as well.
Is this, I just presume chat, is this use case a case where link ID history is most helpful in terms of like content sharing between courses or deployments, or you know, when you're doing course iteration or things like that, and like copying from one term to another and wanting to use the same content, and like you would give a hint to the tool that you want to copy from a resource that was previously identified by a different link ID?
Yes, potentially. It depends on, again, it depends on a tool by tool basis of exactly what your tool is doing. If you have a resource that you actually want to copy from one place to another, then the resource link ID history is useful to sort of say, I want to create this resource and clone it so that I have an independent copy of that resource again. Whereas you might have some static resource that's never going to change, like a book or something like that, that is always going to be the same ID. In that case, you would use a custom parameter to pass it around, because you would want, you would always want it to be that singular resource on your end, as opposed to
I see.
cloning
So
that
the
resource
tool would
each time.
expose a custom parameter so that basically in that case, the resource link ID is kind of ignored in that relationship, and you're just like referencing the internal identifier.
Yeah, really, resource link ID should really hopefully slightly vanish off the horizon. And also what you could use, and I know that's what we're using, we use static, actually we use URLs, but custom parameters, it's the same idea anyway, and are better anyway, to know which content we need to copy. And we use the context ID history, which is a history of the copies of the course, not of the link, but of the courses, to carry on customization of that could have been done to that content in a given course. So the context ID history tells us the customization to bring for a piece of content.
I see. So, okay, so basically what you're talking, there are two cases. One is we want to use the same thing, and in that case, you use custom parameter to reference the same thing in the new placement.
Yes.
Second one would be you want to copy the thing, and in that case, you use ID history to hint to the tool to copy it.
Go ahead, Eric.
Can I chime in a little? This is Eric Preston from Blackboard. When LTI was invented over 10 years ago, we didn't have deep linking, and we didn't have any way for the tool to tell the platform what that resource was, what the resource on their side was. So all we had was the resource link ID from the platform. That's a primary key into the platform's database. So for the tool to be relying on that key to reference their resource in their database is really not a good idea. But it's all we had 10 years ago. But fast forward to 2020, we have deep linking. We have the ability for when you create content that is linked from the platform, that you can define the IDs that you need to track that content. The resource link ID history and even the course ID history is not mandated by the spec. It's in the spec, but it's not required by the spec. So relying on course copy history also is a really bad idea in most cases. And so
that's good to know.
You need
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, I understand with deep linking, you know, you then have the ability to select a resource for your placement, which is a really good thing, and then you can reference that. But I'm trying to figure out from like a course iteration or, you know, workflow efficiency model, right? Are we saying that in order to copy a course to be used in another term, or to copy content to be used in another course, that you would need to do a deep linking launch for every piece of content,
Well, yes.
or use an internal tool identifier.
Right. So think about this. You've got a course. It's got a bunch of content in the course. How do you get that content in there? Do you hand code every LTI URL, or do you use deep linking to get that content into the course? Because those are really your only two choices.
It really depends.
Right,
on
and in
application.
1.1, your only choice is the hand coding choice.
Right, but why would you do that now that you have deep linking, which gives you the ability to insert content into a course at a much more efficient, easy to use way?
And you do that in
your
your master
course.
course.
Adoption, right?
Yeah.
It's all about adoption of tools and platforms.
Well, but even LTI 1.1 has deep linking.
Mm-hmm.
It was added after the fact, but it has deep
But again, not every tool supports.
Fair enough. All I'm saying is if you want to rely on a primary key in my database, you're asking for trouble.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But just to clarify the flow is that you use deep linking in your master course, because we have this use case a lot. So institution is going to set up a master course, usually using deep linking. The links come fully defined, and then sections are created, which are copies. And those sections carries exactly the links, exactly with the same parameters, and they deep link to our content. And in addition to that, we know, we get the context ID history when we have it. That tells us, so we can bring additional customization that was done in the master in our environment. So this we use a mix of those. But yeah, so, and also it's very important because you can use common cartridge then. You don't have to copy in the same system, because this data you put in deep linking is going to be serialized in the cartridge and therefore going to be portable to other environments.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these things make sense. There are just a lot of considerations when you get to like faculty level control of section content versus editing the master course content, and like all of these different iteration cases that I think, you know, what you're saying in terms of hinting at resource link ID becoming less useful, all of this is really good context. And I think it would be wonderful if there was some sort of cohesive write-up around like content versioning and iteration to give more clear guidance to both tools and platforms on how to do this. Because at least in my organization, there are a lot of people kind of like floundering their way through to figure this out. And that level of like more clear guidance would be certainly helpful.
I totally agree. This is Kimberly Gray from UV. How's it going, guys? Claude and I actually yesterday did a webinar on creating contingency plans for education and the value of remote learning. And last month on our mobile task force, we had a pretty in-depth conversation around all of this. And now it seems more essential than ever, right? So how can we figure out how a consensus on content versions and integrations? Because as a product developer that has a mobile app that has the ability to respond to assignments and do mobile assessments and surveys, that could easily either go to the institutional server and then to LMS. It should be available offline on the app and maybe on web as well. I could really use some guidance to make this tool, whether deep link or whatever, as easy as possible to be integrated. Maybe it's a matter of access codes, or like you said, changing the keys, but I would love some more direction on that.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we can kind of come to later on. And again, they're not necessarily things that we have definitive answers for now. I think for the purposes of this session, we'll kind of move on to some of the other questions, but we can, you know, more than happy to kind of go more into depth in this for any of the general meetings if people want to join in and contribute and, you know, have queries like this of possible ways that they can you know, improve the specifications and kind of help us out in that way. Then yeah, it'd be great to see some people on our usual weekly call to kind of discuss that and see what we can bring forward. So
okay, great, thanks.
Thank you.
So just quickly, jumping on to a couple of the other questions that people had sent in. So we had most of the questions, I think, that were sent in after the fact relate back to ones that we have further on in the presentation. So if we just carry on down here, so I'm going to defer to Claude on this one, which is what types of scores and details can be returned by the assignments and grade service in LTI Advantage?
Yeah, and so
keep it fairly short because I think
yeah,
we're running a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So basically, it's just points based. Yeah, so it's just points versus points maximum. So 10 out of 20, 15 out of 50. The only thing also that the assignment and grade service allows you to pass is a status. So you don't always have to return a grade. You can say this is completed, but it's waiting instructor action to get the grade. So there is a status and a grade. But when it comes purely to the score, it's just points based for the time being.
Yeah. It is also possible to return multiple line items if you wanted to return multiple scores, but those line items aren't related to one another in the sense that you can't say, this is like a sub score of this other one. You can't do like accumulations of scores or anything like that yet. Again, these are potentials for down the line, but for now, we wanted to kind of keep the scope of that specification manageable. And when these use cases kind of come up and become more prevalent, we will hopefully be able to action them and do another revision of the grading service 3.0.
Yeah, there is a big specification in IMS called CASE, which serves around competency and rubrics. And that's where we're thinking of seeing how we can align to it and enrich our payload to possibly include additional data around how the score was built up. But that's future talk. That's something we've just started looking at.
Yeah. All right. So the next question that came up, and as you can tell from the questions that people have already asked during this session, things like this do come up quite a lot of how to handle course copy in LTI 1.3. So I think we've already kind of touched on this. The recommended way for the moment is to use the substitution variables for the resource link ID history and the context ID history that allows you to track where a particular resource link was copied from, so you can use that previous resource as a template. You can also do this your own way through deep linking and having a custom parameter that says, this is my template, this is my original resource, however you want to handle that. The next one. Okay, so again, this one was kind of brought up in the questions before, of which IDs can I use to identify my resource in deep LTI launch or deep linking? Well, yeah, so you can either use a custom parameter or you can use the resource link ID. And if you're using the custom parameter, you can point that to your internal ID for whatever resource you're looking at. What are the next steps for mobile and LTI for LMS? That should probably say.
Yeah. So I'll take this one. It's an easy one, isn't it? So actually, we're still looking for people to help us. I know Kimberly, we've been working together, but try on the technical side also to try to basically come up with answers. So we're still looking for volunteers to join a task force there. And there are two angles to the task force. The first one is how do we do deep linking? I mean, how do you launch a mobile app from your LMS? And LMS can mean LMS web or LMS its own mobile app. So trying to define deep linking mechanic there, and the deep linking is a complicated matter in mobile world. So that's why we can help some engineering background. And there is another side to this conversation, which is how can we, from the mobile app and having a mobile app first experience, integrate back to the LMS through enriching the LTI Advantage API to allow access. One example would be, for example, to be able to get a user's enrollment from the app, to be able to allow to get the user from the app itself rather than having to go to the LMS and ping pong between LMS and app. So that's really an API enrichment that's mobile and app first driven. That's one
Yes.
side, and the other one is deep linking.
Hey, Claude, I just want to say from UCF, we just saw in the new Canvas app the integration between Zoom and how going from an online course in the Canvas app to the Zoom conference. This has been, it's been amazing for us with everything that's going on right now. And all I've been hearing from our faculty and our mobile support people is, can you do this for other LTIs? And it's
Yeah,
like,
exactly. So that's why we need the guys at Canvas that did that to join and
Yes, please put out the beacon. That's exactly what we're talking about. And right now, more than ever, I mean, I just want to remind you guys, you know, a lot of funding, like I'm sure education, you know, behind healthcare is the second most important thing in this country. So we really, I implore you, for us to set up another meeting, possibly by the end of this week or early next, to talk about how we can get these integrations going. Because we're up and running, and I can share some of the successes we've had with CUNY, with the CUNY system, City Universities of New York. And it's a great, I have a 9-year-old, and, you know, the stuff they're sending home, we're in New York with the DOE here, is like PDFs and printouts. I mean, there's no type of assessment mechanism. So a lot of that is siloed within UVI per course. But yeah, I would love to talk more about this.
Yeah, just one last thing on mobile, and I think there's a conversation we had yesterday made it even more important to realize that a lot of our, especially in K-12, a lot of students actually don't have desktops and don't have access to computers. And for accessibility reasons, having a solution, interoperability solutions that include the mobile ecosystem is an important thing to.
yes, 100%, 100%.
All right.
Thank you for bringing it up.
No problem. So this kind of leads into our last question on here very nicely, which is, there's some functionality that is not currently supported by LTI and its sister specifications. What can I do about it? So if you are a contributing member to the IMS, then you can join the weekly LTI working group call. You can bring forward any proposals that you have, help us with writing specifications, anything like that. Bringing in other members who you think might be able to help with something, or have a similar use case that needs solving. Having all of these people together really helps us move the specifications forward, and having real life use cases where people have a problem that they need to solve. Generally what we try and do is if there is a problem that people are going to solve anyway, we try and get them to solve it in as close to standards way as possible, and then we can steal the solution and make it into a much more widely accessible kind of specification for everybody to use.
Steal, probably not the best operative word.
Not quite.
But yeah, I'm joking. I'm joking. Okay, bye.
An example of this being Eric and I work between Turnitin and Blackboard to write the group specification for LTI as the extension service. We could have done a custom service between Blackboard and Turnitin, but instead we decided to take a little bit of extra time to standardize what we were doing. We had to solve the problem, so we may as well do it in a standard way that other people can then use. So yeah, if you're not a contributing member, I would get into contact with either Mark or Mark McKell, or even Bracken can help people out with what resources are available. If people still have ideas and questions around things, then people are still here to be able to answer those questions. But yeah, if you are a contributing member and you have something that you think is not moving fast enough or is not going in the direction that you want it to, then please join the calls and make it so. And I think that is the end of the questions that we had lined up. If anybody has anything, we've only got 6 minutes left, so probably don't have a great deal of time for further discussions, but if anybody has a question that they think we can kind of hop through quickly, then.
Sure. Hi, Martin. This is Carlos from Pressbooks. I just have a quick question. Would you please recommend me the best way to test, as a developer, the best way to test the grade passback from the tool to an LMS? As just a context, I did a setup with our tool, Pressbooks, and we are sending back to Moodle a grade. We're getting as response a 200, but we're not getting the body. We're just getting a 200 without a body. And basically we're getting the HTML code of the login page. So probably I'm thinking there's a more generic way to test it.
Yeah, so in the link that was on a previous slide, I'll go back a bit here. So this repo that has all the bootcamp resources, there are a bunch of different things that you can test with that. There is a link to the IMS reference implementation as well. The reference implementation will allow you to basically install your tool on the reference implementation, and that does grade passback, it does deep linking, it does names and roles, and you can test sending grades back, and it will tell you whether it got what it was expecting and anything else like that. It's also worth, even if you're not ready to fully certify, you can run it through the certification suite. The certification suite will also tell you if you are returning anything incorrectly, or having any issues with that.
And you can ping me on the Moodle side. We pass back grades to Moodle all the time, and I've never seen a 200 login. At least I've never seen any issue with that. So it tells, internally we use Moodle as our test bed because it's easy to install and stuff. So, it's not been causing issue. Don't.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll ping you. Thank you.
Okay.
No problem. Any other last minute requests, questions?
Hi, I was wondering, this is Marty. I was wondering if you have any pointers to anything that talks about best practices for being able to communicate time in a tool back to a platform. Is there anything I haven't seen anything in the spec that specifically handles that type of information exchange, but I guess I was just wondering whether there are best practices that people are following.
Yeah. Victor is a Caliper event for doing that. Do you know if Victor's still on the call?
I am. Caliper event, sorry, for doing what?
For indicating the time spent using a tool.
So that's a tricky question. So Caliper does not like making statements that aggregate data. The typical pattern Caliper would expect is that it send facts about things when they occur, and that interpreting platforms make inferences based on those facts. Caliper has an event in 1.2 that tracks when a tool is launched, an event that tracks when a tool returns to the platform, and it has an event, a simple event, that tools can use to indicate that the tool is being used consistent with what it would expect. Obviously, Caliper also has finer grain events for more specific actions, but those are the very basic ones.
Do those events come from the LMS or from the tool?
The tool launch and tool return are expected to come from the platform, and the tool use would come from any software application that's providing user experience to a user.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with the recent addition of the Caliper Connect service, what that allows you to do is define a Caliper endpoint in an LTI launch as an LTI service using all the LTI authentication.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, that hasn't yet been implemented by platforms. what Martin just talked about, that's before the tab right now, isn't it, Martin?
It's now in
It's an IP review, right?
no, it's gone through IP review.
Oh, has it?
It is now in member candidate final.
Okay. I can't remember whether I voted on that or not. So it's either before the tab vote or it's past the tab vote and is now a final spec. I'm not sure, but it's kind of at that stage of things, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's currently available to all members. It's not public
Right.
final yet.
Right. Another thing to say is that for Caliper 1.2, we have also added a very simple mechanism for communicating measured aggregates. So time on task or duration of use, I believe, is one of the measured aggregates that can be sent. So a tool use event I believe, could include a measured aggregate value that would say, user is using the tool correctly and has been using it for 10 minutes. Obviously, the minute you start sending aggregate data, then you start asking really sort of pointed questions about how those aggregates are formed, how they're put together, all sorts of questions, right?
Yeah. So I think we're just about out of time now. So I think we'll have to cut the conversation short there. But yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming along. If you still have any burning questions, don't worry, we are still available to ask these questions. We have a little bit of a question block at the end of every roundtable that we do. So there is a form, I think it should be in the agenda document for submitting questions. So if you have any, please submit them and we'll try and get round to answering them in the next roundtable that we do. And yeah, hopefully we'll see everybody then. I think Bracken is having some mic issues, so he's asked me to do the sign off. So yeah, I just want to thank everybody for coming and hope everybody has a safe evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.